The helicopter blades cut through the morning air like angry wasps. Inside the aircraft, 12 Navy SEALs sat in complete silence. Their faces showed no emotion, but their eyes told a different story. They were heading into enemy territory in Afghanistan, and everyone knew not all of them might come back. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison looked around at his team. These were the best of the best, men who had trained for years to become the most elite fighting force in the world. They had been through hell together in training, and they had been through hell together in combat. But today felt different. Today, they had someone new with them. Dr. Sarah Chen sat quietly in the corner of the helicopter. She was their new combat medic, and she looked completely out of place among these giant warriors. At barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing maybe 120 pounds, she seemed like she could be blown away by the wind from the helicopter blades. Her medical bag sat between her feet, and she kept checking her equipment over and over again. The SEALs had been told very little about her. All they knew was that she was a Navy doctor who had volunteered for combat duty. She had passed all the medical training requirements, but none of them had worked with her before. In their world, trust meant everything. When bullets started flying, you needed to know that the person next to you would have your back. Dr. Chen was an unknown factor, and that made everyone nervous. Petty Officer First Class. Mike Tank Rodriguez glanced over at her and shook his head slightly. Tank was a mountain of a man, standing 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighing 280 pounds of pure muscle. He had been a SEAL for 8 years and had seen more combat than most soldiers see in a lifetime. The idea of depending on this tiny woman to patch him up in a firefight didn't sit well with him. "Hey, Doc," Tank called out over the noise of the helicopter. "You sure you're ready for this? This ain't like patching up sailors with the flu back on base." Dr. Chen looked up at him with calm brown eyes. She didn't seem intimidated by his size or his aggressive tone. "I'm ready, Petty Officer Rodriguez," she replied simply. Tank laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "We'll see about that, Doc. We'll see about that." The mission was supposed to be straightforward. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target was hiding in a compound in the mountains. The target was believed to be a bomb maker who had been responsible for several attacks on American forces. The SEALs were to go in fast, capture or eliminate the target, gather intelligence, and get out before enemy reinforcements could arrive. But as every SEAL knew, no mission ever went exactly according to plan. The helicopter began its descent toward the landing zone. Through the small windows, the team could see the rugged Afghan mountains stretching out in every direction. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving, filled with caves and hiding places where enemies could wait in ambush. It was the kind of place where one wrong step could mean death. 2 minutes out, the pilot announced over the intercom. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stood up and addressed his team. "Remember, we go in fast and quiet. Tank and Rodriguez take point. Williams and Peterson cover the rear. Doc stays in the middle where we can protect her. Questions?" There were no questions. These men had done this hundreds of times before. They knew their jobs and they knew how to do them well. Dr. Chen stood up and checked her medical bag one more time. Inside, she had everything she might need to save a life in combat. Bandages, blood-clotting agents, morphine, surgical tools, and a dozen other items that could mean the difference between life and death. She had trained with this equipment for months, but she had never used it in real combat before. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust. Before the aircraft had even stopped moving, the SEALs were jumping out and taking defensive positions. They moved like a well-oiled machine, each man knowing exactly where he needed to be and what he needed to do. Dr. Chen jumped out last, staying low as she had been trained. The helicopter immediately lifted off again, leaving the team alone in hostile territory. The sound of the rotors faded quickly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press down on them from all sides. The compound they were targeting was about 2 miles away, hidden in a valley between 2 ridges. Getting there would require crossing open ground where they would be exposed to enemy fire. It was dangerous, but it was the only way to approach without being detected. The team began moving in single file, with Tank taking point and using his night vision goggles to scan for threats. Behind him, the other SEALs spread out in a tactical formation that would allow them to respond quickly to an attack from any direction. Dr. Chen stayed in the middle of the formation, trying to match the pace of the much larger men around her. After an hour of careful movement, they reached a ridge overlooking the target compound. Lieutenant Commander Morrison pulled out his binoculars and studied the building below. It was a typical Afghan compound, surrounded by high walls with several smaller buildings inside. Intelligence reports indicated that the bomb maker was hiding in the main building, along with several armed guards. "Looks quiet," Morrison whispered into his radio. "I count 2 sentries on the walls, but I don't see any other movement." The plan was simple. Half the team would create a diversion at the front gate, while the other half climbed over the back wall. In the confusion, they would hopefully be able to capture their target before he could escape or destroy any evidence. But as they prepared to move out, something went wrong. A shot rang out from somewhere in the darkness. One of the sentries on the wall had spotted something and fired a warning shot. Suddenly, the quiet compound exploded into activity. Lights came on, men began shouting, and the sound of automatic weapons filled the air. "We've been made," Morrison said grimly. "Change of plans. We go in hard and fast." The SEALs didn't hesitate. They had trained for this exact situation hundreds of times. When stealth failed, they relied on speed and overwhelming firepower to accomplish their mission. Tank led the charge down the ridge toward the compound. His massive frame moved surprisingly fast as he zigzagged between rocks and bushes to avoid enemy fire. Behind him, the other SEALs followed, their weapons ready and their training taking over. Dr. Chen ran with them, her medical bag bouncing against her hip with each step. She had never been in a real firefight before, and the sound of bullets flying overhead was terrifying. But she forced herself to keep moving, knowing that the SEALs were counting on her. They reached the compound wall just as the defenders began firing in earnest. Bullets sparked off the rocks around them, and the air filled with the sharp crack of rifle fire. Tank pulled out a small explosive charge and attached it to the wall. "Fire in the hole!" he shouted. The explosion blew a hole in the wall big enough for the team to get through. Tank was the first one in, his weapon ready as he scanned for targets. The other SEALs followed quickly, spreading out to cover all angles of attack. The compound was in chaos. Armed men were running in all directions, some trying to set up defensive positions while others seemed to be trying to escape. The SEALs moved with deadly efficiency, their superior training and equipment giving them a significant advantage. But the enemy had the advantage of numbers and knowledge of the terrain. For every fighter the SEALs eliminated, 2 more seemed to appear from hidden positions. What was supposed to be a quick in-and-out mission was turning into a prolonged firefight. "Williams is hit!" someone shouted over the radio. Dr. Chen's heart jumped into her throat. This was what she had trained for, but now that it was actually happening, she felt a moment of panic. Then her medical training kicked in, and she began moving toward the sound of the voice. She found Petty Officer Williams behind a low wall, clutching his shoulder. Blood was seeping between his fingers, and his face was pale with pain and shock. Dr. Chen dropped to her knees beside him and immediately began assessing his wound. "How bad is it, Doc?" Williams asked through gritted teeth. Dr. Chen cut away his uniform to get a better look at the wound. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, missing the major arteries but causing significant damage to the muscle and bone. It was serious, but not life-threatening if treated properly. "You'll live," she told him as she began applying pressure bandages. "But you're done fighting for today." Around them, the firefight continued. Bullets whistled overhead, and the sound of explosions echoed off the compound walls. Dr. Chen tried to ignore the chaos as she worked on Williams, focusing entirely on stopping the bleeding and stabilizing his condition. "Peterson's down!" came another shout from across the compound. Dr. Chen looked up from Williams. Peterson was one of the youngest members of the team, barely 22 years old. She could see him lying motionless near the main building, but there was too much enemy fire between them for her to reach him safely. "I have to go to him," she told Williams. "Doc, no!" Williams grabbed her arm with his good hand. "It's too dangerous. You'll get yourself killed." But Dr. Chen was already moving. She grabbed her medical bag and began running across the compound, staying low and zigzagging to avoid the enemy fire. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet, and she could hear tanks shouting at her to get down, but she kept running. She reached Peterson just as a burst of automatic weapon fire tore up the ground where she had been standing a second before. The young SEAL was unconscious, with a severe head wound that was bleeding heavily. Dr. Chen immediately began working to stop the bleeding and check for other injuries. Peterson had taken shrapnel from an explosion, and his condition was much more serious than Williams. Dr. Chen worked frantically, using every skill she had learned in medical school and combat training. She managed to stop the worst of the bleeding, but Peterson needed immediate evacuation to a real hospital if he was going to survive. "Morrison!" she shouted into her radio. "Peterson needs immediate evacuation. He won't survive without surgery." "Negative, Doc," came the reply. "The LZ is too hot. We can't call in a chopper until we secure the area." Dr. Chen looked around at the ongoing firefight. The SEALs were holding their own, but they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. It could be hours before they secured the area, and Peterson didn't have hours. "Then we make our own LZ," she said quietly. Nobody heard her over the noise of the battle, but Dr. Chen had made a decision. She couldn't save Peterson by hiding behind cover and waiting for the fighting to end. Sometimes being a combat medic meant taking risks that other people couldn't or wouldn't take. She began dragging Peterson toward a more defensible position, using her own body to shield him from enemy fire. It was slow, dangerous work, but she refused to give up. Every few yards, she had to stop and check his vital signs, making sure he was still alive. Tanks saw what she was doing and tried to provide covering fire, but there were too many enemies and not enough SEALs. Dr. Chen was on her own in the middle of a war zone with nothing but her medical training and her determination to keep a young man alive. As she worked, the other SEALs began to see Dr. Chen in a new light. This tiny woman who had seemed so out of place among them was risking her own life to save one of their teammates. She wasn't hiding behind cover or waiting for someone else to take care of the problem. She was doing her job, no matter what the cost. The firefight raged on around them, but Dr. Chen never stopped working. She had found her place among these elite warriors, not by trying to be like them, but by being exactly what they needed her to be. A healer who would never give up no matter how desperate the situation became. But the real test was still to come. The enemy was regrouping for a major assault, and the SEALs were running out of options. In the next few hours, Dr. Chen would have to prove herself in ways she had never imagined, and the secrets of her past were about to be revealed in the most dramatic way possible. The compound had become a death trap. What started as a simple capture mission had turned into a full-scale battle. Enemy fighters kept appearing from hidden tunnels and concealed positions, and the SEALs found themselves surrounded with no easy way out. Dr. Chen continued working on Peterson while bullets flew overhead. The young SEAL was stable for now, but his condition remained critical. She had managed to stop the bleeding from his head wound, but without proper surgery, he wouldn't survive much longer. Every few minutes, she checked his pulse and breathing, praying that help would arrive in time. "Doc, we need to move," Lieutenant Commander Morrison shouted over the gunfire. "They're setting up mortars on the ridge. This whole place is about to get blown to pieces." Dr. Chen looked up from Peterson to see Morrison crouched behind a wall about 20 feet away. His uniform was torn and dirty, and she could see blood on his left arm where a bullet had grazed him. Around the compound, the other SEALs were in similar condition. They were all wounded to some degree, running low on ammunition and facing overwhelming odds. "Peterson can't be moved yet," Dr. Chen called back. "Give me 5 more minutes to stabilize him." "We don't have 5 minutes," Morrison replied. "Those mortars will be operational any second now." As if to prove his point, a loud whistling sound filled the air, followed by a massive explosion about 50 yards away. The ground shook, and debris rained down on them from the blast. The enemy mortars were already firing, and it was only a matter of time before they found their range. Dr. Chen made a quick decision. She pulled out a syringe and gave Peterson an injection of stimulant that would help keep his blood pressure up during transport. It was risky, but it was the only way to move him safely. "Okay, he's ready," she announced. "But someone needs to help me carry him." Tank appeared beside her almost immediately. The big SEAL had been providing covering fire while she worked, and his ammunition was almost gone. Without hesitation, he slung his weapon over his shoulder and helped Dr. Chen lift Peterson onto his back. "Where to, Doc?" Tank asked. Before she could answer, another mortar round exploded, this one much closer. The blast knocked all 3 of them to the ground, and Dr. Chen felt sharp pain in her left leg where a piece of shrapnel had hit her. She looked down to see blood seeping through her uniform pants, but there was no time to treat her own wound. "The main building?" she said, pointing toward the largest structure in the compound. "It looks like it has a basement. We can set up a defensive position there and call for evacuation." Tank nodded and began moving toward the building, carrying Peterson like he weighed nothing. Dr. Chen limped alongside them, ignoring the pain in her leg and focusing on keeping Peterson stable. Around them, the other SEALs provided covering fire as they moved. They reached the main building just as another mortar round destroyed the wall where they had been hiding moments before. Morrison kicked in the door, and the team rushed inside. The building was dark and empty, but Tank quickly found a stairway leading down to a basement level. The basement was perfect for their needs. It had thick concrete walls that would provide protection from mortar fire, and there was only one entrance, which they could easily defend. More importantly, it had enough space for Dr. Van Chen to set up a proper medical station. "Rodriguez, Williams, watch the stairs," Morrison ordered. "Everyone else, secure the perimeter and check for other ways in or out." Dr. Chen immediately began setting up her equipment. She had Peterson on an improvised stretcher made from a door they had found upstairs, and she connected him to a portable IV drip to help replace the blood he had lost. Her own leg wound was throbbing, but she pushed the pain aside and focused on her patient. "How's he doing, Doc?" Tank asked. Despite his earlier doubts about her, he was now clearly concerned about both Peterson and Dr. Chen herself. "Better, but still critical," she replied honestly. "He needs surgery within the next few hours or he's going to die." Morrison tried the radio again, but all he got was static. The thick concrete walls were blocking their communications, and they had no way to call for backup or evacuation. They were on their own until they could figure out a way to get out of this basement alive. "What about the satellite phone?" Dr. Chen asked. Morrison shook his head. "Destroyed in the first explosion. We're completely cut off." Outside, they could hear enemy fighters moving around the building. The mortars had stopped for now, but it was clear that the enemy was planning something. They had the SEALs trapped in the basement, and they could afford to take their time planning their next move. "They're going to try to flush us out with grenades," Morrison said quietly. "Or maybe they'll just collapse the building on top of us." Dr. Chen continued working on Peterson while she listened to the discussion. The SEALs were trained for situations like this, but she could hear the concern in their voices. They were trapped with limited ammunition and no way to call for help. Their situation was desperate. That's when Tank made an observation that changed everything. "Hey, Doc," he said, looking at the way she was working on Peterson. "Where did you learn to do field surgery like that? That's not the kind of stuff they teach in Navy medical school." Dr. Chen looked up from her patient. All the SEALs were watching her now, waiting for her answer. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that eventually someone would start asking questions about her background. "I learned it in Afghanistan," she said simply. Morrison frowned. "Afghanistan? When were you in Afghanistan? Your file says this is your first deployment." Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Outside, they could hear the enemy fighters getting closer. She knew that in a few minutes those men would probably try to storm the basement, and some or all of the SEALs might die in the fighting that followed. They deserved to know who they were fighting alongside. "My file is incomplete," she said finally. "I wasn't always a Navy doctor." She continued working on Peterson as she spoke, her hands steady despite the emotional difficulty of what she was revealing. "5 years ago, I was Dr. Sarah Chen, trauma surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. I had a good life, a successful career, and plans to get married to another doctor. But my younger brother was a Marine, and he was killed by an IED in Helmand Province." The SEALs listened in silence as she continued her story. "After his funeral, I couldn't go back to my old life. I couldn't stand the idea of spending my days doing routine surgeries while American soldiers were dying overseas. So I joined the Army as a combat medic." Tank's eyes widened. "Army? But you're Navy now." "I served 3 tours as an Army combat medic before transferring to the Navy," Dr. Chen explained. "I saw action in some of the worst places you can imagine: Fallujah, Kandahar, the Korengal Valley. I've treated more combat wounds than most military doctors see in their entire careers." Morrison was staring at her with new understanding. "What was your Army unit?" Dr. Chen hesitated for a moment before answering. "1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment." The basement went completely silent. Every SEAL in the room knew what that meant. The 75th Ranger Regiment was one of the most elite units in the Army, and their medics saw more combat than almost anyone else in the military. If Dr. Chen had served with the Rangers, she had been in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. "Jesus Christ," Tank whispered. "You were a Ranger medic?" Dr. Chen nodded. "For 3 years. I treated wounded Rangers in firefights that lasted for days. I've performed surgery in caves while under enemy fire. I've crawled through minefields to reach wounded soldiers. I've done things that most people couldn't imagine." Williams, who had been quiet since being wounded, spoke up from his position by the stairs. "What's your call sign, Doc?" Dr. Chen looked at him for a moment before answering. "Angel." The nickname said everything. In the military, medics who earned call signs like that were the ones who had saved lives in impossible situations. They were the ones who never gave up, no matter how bad things got. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" Morrison asked. "Because it doesn't matter," Dr. Chen replied. "I'm not a Ranger anymore. I'm a Navy doctor who volunteered for combat duty because I wanted to help. My past doesn't change who I am now." Tank shook his head in amazement. "Doc, your past changes everything. We thought we were protecting some inexperienced doctor who had never seen combat, but you've probably seen more action than half of us combined." Dr. Chen finished adjusting Peterson's IV and finally allowed herself to sit down for a moment. Her leg wound was still bleeding, but she ignored it as she looked around at the SEALs. "The reason I didn't tell you is because I wanted you to judge me based on what I could do, not what I used to do," she said. "I've seen too many soldiers get preferential treatment because of their past accomplishments. I wanted to earn your respect the hard way." Morrison laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Doc, you earned our respect about 2 hours ago when you ran across an open courtyard under heavy fire to treat Peterson. The fact that you used to be a Ranger just explains why you were crazy enough to do it." Outside, the sounds of movement were getting closer. The enemy fighters were preparing for their assault, and the SEALs needed to get ready. But the revelation about Dr. Chen's background had changed the dynamic of the team completely. "Okay, Angel," Morrison said, using her old call sign. What do you think our best option is? You've been in situations like this before. Dr. Chen considered their options. They were trapped in a basement with limited ammunition and no way to call for help. Peterson needed immediate medical attention that she couldn't provide with her field equipment, and outside, an unknown number of enemy fighters were preparing to attack. "In the Rangers, we had a saying," she said finally. "Sometimes the only way out is through." Tank grinned for the first time since the mission began. "I like the way you think, Doc. What did you have in mind?" Dr. Chen pointed toward the ceiling. "The building above us is old and probably not very well constructed. If we could create a controlled explosion in the right place, we might be able to bring down part of the roof and create our own exit while taking out some of the enemy at the same time." Morrison looked thoughtful. "That's incredibly dangerous. If we miscalculate, we could bring the whole building down on top of us." "It's dangerous," Dr. Chen agreed, "but staying here is also dangerous. At least this way, we take control of the situation instead of waiting for them to come to us." The SEALs looked at each other. They were all thinking the same thing. This tiny woman, who they had initially dismissed as inexperienced, was now suggesting a plan that was so audacious it might actually work. "What about Peterson?" Williams asked. "He can't survive that kind of explosion." Dr. Chen had already thought of that. "We move him to the far corner and create a protected area using debris from upstairs. The explosion will be controlled and directed away from his position. It's risky, but it's better than the alternatives." Morrison made his decision. "Okay, Angel. It's your plan. How do we do it?" Dr. Chen smiled grimly. For the first time since the mission began, she felt like she was back in familiar territory. This was the kind of desperate, improvised operation that had kept her alive during her 3 tours with the Rangers. "First, we need to get Peterson ready for transport," she said. "Then we need to gather all our remaining explosives and position them strategically in the ceiling supports. Finally, we need to create a diversion that will draw as many enemy fighters as possible to the wrong location." Tank was already moving to help with Peterson. "What kind of diversion, Doc?" Dr. Chen's smile became even grimmer. "The kind that only a former Ranger medic would think of. Trust me, they'll never see it coming." Dr. Chen moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before. Her plan was risky and complicated, but it was their only chance of getting out alive. She quickly explained the details to the team while she continued monitoring Peterson's condition. "The explosives need to be placed along the main support beam that runs across the center of the ceiling," she said, pointing upward. "When we detonate them, it should bring down a section of the roof and create an opening we can use to escape. But the timing has to be perfect." Tank climbed up on a makeshift ladder made from debris and began placing small charges along the beam. As a demolitions expert, he understood exactly what Dr. Chen was planning, and he had to admit it was brilliant. The controlled explosion would not only create their escape route, but would also likely take out several enemy fighters who were positioning themselves above them. "What about the diversion?" Morrison asked. Dr. Chen reached into her medical bag and pulled out several smoke grenades and flares. "We're going to make them think we're trying to escape through the front of the building. I'll create a medical emergency signal that should draw most of their attention to the wrong location." Williams looked confused. "Medical emergency signal?" In Afghanistan, enemy fighters learned to recognize certain patterns of smoke and flare signals that indicated wounded Americans calling for help, Dr. Chen explained. They would often concentrate their forces around those areas, trying to ambush rescue teams. "We're going to use that against them." She began preparing the signal devices while explaining the rest of the plan. "Tank, how long do you need to finish placing the charges?" "Give me 10 more minutes," Tank replied from his position near the ceiling. "Perfect. Morrison, I need you and Rodriguez to create some noise at the front entrance. Make it sound like we're trying to break out that way. Williams, despite your wound, I need you to help me create a protective barrier around Peterson." Dr. Chen had transformed from the quiet, uncertain medic they had started with into a confident combat leader. Her experience with the Rangers was showing, and the SEALs responded to her leadership naturally. In desperate situations, rank mattered less than competence, and Dr. Chen clearly knew what she was doing. As they prepared for the escape attempt, Dr. Chen finally took a moment to treat her own wound. The shrapnel in her leg had gone deeper than she initially thought, and she was losing more blood than she could afford. She quickly cleaned and bandaged the wound, then gave herself an injection of pain medication so she could continue functioning. "Doc, you okay?" Tank asked, noticing her pale complexion. "I'll live," she replied, though privately she wasn't entirely sure about that. The wound was serious, and she was starting to feel dizzy from blood loss. But Peterson's condition was still more critical than hers, and she couldn't afford to slow down now. "Charges are set," Tank announced as he climbed down from the ceiling. "Ready when you are, Angel." Dr. Chen checked her watch. They had been trapped in the basement for almost 2 hours, and enemy forces were continuing to build up outside. Through the small basement windows, they could see shadows moving back and forth as fighters took positions around the building. Time was running out. "Okay, here's how this works," Dr. Chen said, gathering the team around her. "Morrison and Rodriguez create the diversion at the front entrance. Make it loud and make it believable. Williams, you stay with Peterson and be ready to move him the instant the charges go off. Tank, you handle the detonation. I'll signal when everyone is in position." She paused and looked around at each of them. "Once we start this, there's no going back. We'll have maybe 30 seconds between the explosion and when the enemy figures out what happened. That's our window to get Peterson out and reach the extraction point." Morrison nodded grimly. "What if the explosion doesn't work the way we planned?" "Then we improvise," Dr. Chen replied. "That's what Rangers do." The team moved into position. Morrison and Rodriguez crept up the stairs and began making noise near the front entrance, shouting orders and firing their weapons sporadically to make it sound like they were preparing for a breakout attempt. At the same time, Dr. Chen activated her medical emergency signal outside the building. The plan worked perfectly. Within minutes, they could hear enemy fighters moving toward the front of the building, drawn by the sounds of activity and the medical emergency signal. Dr. Chen monitored their movement through the basement windows, waiting for the right moment to give Tank the signal. "Now," she whispered. Tank triggered the detonation. The explosion was deafening in the confined space of the basement. The main support beam cracked and gave way, bringing down a large section of the ceiling and roof above them. Debris rained down, but Dr. Chen had calculated the collapse pattern correctly. The falling rubble created a ramp leading up to a hole in the roof, exactly as she had planned. "Go! Go! Go!" Dr. Chen shouted. Tank immediately picked up Peterson and began climbing over the debris toward the opening. Dr. Chen followed closely behind, her medical bag slung over her shoulder and her wounded legs screaming in protest with every step. Morrison and Rodriguez abandoned their diversion and rushed to join them. They emerged through the hole in the roof to find chaos outside. The explosion had indeed taken out several enemy fighters who had been positioned above them, and the others were confused and disorganized. The SEALs had perhaps a minute before the enemy figured out what had happened and began shooting at them again. "The ridge!" Dr. Chen gasped, pointing toward higher ground about 200 yards away. "If we can reach that ridge, we can establish communications and call for extraction." Tank was already moving, carrying Peterson like he was a child. The young SEAL was still unconscious, but his vital signs remained stable. Dr. Chen's field treatment had bought him time, but he still needed surgery soon. They ran across open ground under increasingly heavy fire as the enemy fighters realized what had happened. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet, and Dr. Chen felt the wind from several near misses. Her wounded leg gave out twice, but each time Morrison or Rodriguez grabbed her and helped her keep moving. They reached the ridge just as enemy mortars began firing again. The first rounds exploded far behind them, but Dr. Chen knew the enemy gunners would adjust their aim quickly. They needed cover, and they needed it immediately. "There!" Williams pointed toward a cluster of rocks that would provide some protection from both direct fire and mortar rounds. They dove behind the rocks just as the next mortar barrage arrived. The explosions were much closer this time, and Dr. Chen could feel the shock waves in her chest. But they were alive, and they had successfully escaped from the trap in the basement. Morrison immediately began working with the radio, trying to establish communications with their base. The ridge was high enough that the radio signals weren't blocked by the surrounding terrain, and after several tense minutes, he managed to make contact. "Base, this is Hammer 6, Morrison spoke into the microphone. "We need immediate extraction. We have one critical casualty and multiple wounded. Our position is compromised, and we are taking heavy fire." The response crackled through the static. "Hammer 6, we have birds in the air. Estimated arrival time 20 minutes. Can you hold your position?" Morrison looked around at his team. Tank was still cradling Peterson, who remained unconscious. Williams was bleeding from his shoulder wound, which had reopened during their escape. Rodriguez had taken a bullet in the arm sometime during the firefight, and Dr. Chen was barely staying conscious from her own blood loss. "Negative. Base," Morrison replied. "We need that extraction now. We won't last 20 minutes in this position." Dr. Chen struggled to her feet and took the radio microphone from Morrison. "Base, this is Angel," she said, using her old Ranger call sign. "I have one critical head trauma that needs immediate surgical intervention. If we don't get him out in the next 15 minutes, we're going to lose him." There was a long pause before the response came. "Angel? Angel from the 75th? "Affirmative, Base, and I'm telling you that we need extraction right now." The radio operator's tone changed completely. "Angel, we're scrambling everything we have. Hold your position for 10 more minutes. Help is on the way." Dr. Chen smiled weakly as she handed the radio back to Morrison. "In the military, reputations preceded you, and apparently hers was still remembered. Angel was the medic who had saved dozens of Rangers in impossible situations. When Angel said someone was dying, people listened. But 10 minutes was still a long time when you were under heavy fire with limited ammunition and multiple wounded personnel." The enemy fighters had regrouped and were advancing up the ridge toward their position. Dr. Chen could see them moving from cover to cover, getting closer with each bound. "Tank, how much ammunition do you have left?" Morrison asked. "Maybe 2 magazines," Tank replied, without taking his eyes off Peterson. "Rodriguez?" "1 magazine." Morrison checked his own weapon. "I've got 1.5. "Williams?" Williams tried to lift his rifle with his wounded arm and winced in pain. "I can still shoot, but not very well." Dr. Chen looked at the approaching enemy fighters and made a quick count. There were at least 15 of them that she could see, probably more that were hidden. 4 wounded SEALs with minimal ammunition weren't going to be able to hold them off for 10 minutes. "Give me a weapon," she said quietly. Morrison looked at her in surprise. "Doc, you're a medic. You can't fight." "I'm a former Ranger who happens to be a medic," Dr. Chen corrected him. "And right now, Peterson needs someone to buy him time more than he needs someone to hold his hand." Tank reached into his gear and pulled out a sidearm. "Here, Angel. It's not much, but it's something." Dr. Chen checked the weapon and took a position behind the rocks where she could see the approaching enemy. Her hands were steady despite her blood loss, and her eyes were clear and focused. The other SEALs watched in amazement as the tiny woman transformed once again, this time from medic back to warrior. The enemy fighters were now close enough that Dr. Chen could see their faces. They were moving with the confidence of men who knew they had their prey trapped and outnumbered. They had no idea that they were about to face someone who had survived some of the worst fighting in Afghanistan. "Here they come," Morrison said quietly. The first enemy fighter broke cover and began running toward their position. Dr. Chen tracked him carefully and squeezed the trigger. The fighter went down immediately, his momentum carrying him several more yards before he stopped moving. The other fighters immediately took cover and began firing at the rocks where the SEALs were hidden. But their position had been exposed, and now the SEALs knew exactly where they were hiding. For the next 8 minutes, the fight was desperate and close quarters. The enemy fighters tried several times to rush their position, but each time they were driven back by accurate fire from the SEALs. Dr. Chen proved to be an excellent shot, picking off targets with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. But their ammunition situation was becoming critical. Morrison was down to his last magazine, and the others weren't much better. Dr. Chen had already switched to Tank's backup weapon when her first pistol ran out of ammunition. 2 minutes, Morrison announced, checking his watch. The enemy fighters seemed to sense that the SEALs were running low on ammunition. They began massing for what looked like a final assault. Dr. Chen counted at least 20 fighters positioning themselves for a coordinated attack. "We're not going to make it," Rodriguez said quietly. Dr. Chen looked down at Peterson, who was still unconscious on the improvised stretcher. The young SEAL had survived the firefight in the compound, the explosion in the basement, and the dash across open ground. She wasn't going to let him die now, not when help was so close. "Yes, we are," she said firmly. That's when they heard it, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching fast and low. Dr. Chen looked up to see 2 attack helicopters coming over the ridge, their weapons already firing at the enemy positions below. "Hammer 6, this is Viper 1, came a voice over the radio. "We see your position. Keep your heads down." The helicopters unleashed everything they had on the enemy fighters. Rockets, machine gun fire, and even a few precision missile strikes turned the mountainside into a killing field. The fighters who weren't killed in the initial attack quickly retreated, disappearing into caves and hidden positions where the helicopters couldn't reach them. Behind the attack helicopters came the extraction bird, a large transport helicopter that could carry the entire team back to safety. It touched down on the ridge less than 50 yards from their position, its crew chief already preparing medical equipment for Peterson. Tank carried Peterson to the helicopter while the others provided covering fire. Dr. Chen limped alongside them, refusing help despite her obvious exhaustion and blood loss. She stayed with Peterson until he was safely loaded onto the aircraft and connected to more sophisticated medical equipment. "How is he, Doc?" the flight medic asked as they lifted off. Dr. Chen checked Peterson's vital signs one more time. "He'll live," she said with relief, "but he needs surgery as soon as we reach base." As the helicopter flew away from the mountains, the SEALs sat in exhausted silence. The mission had been a complete disaster from a tactical standpoint, but they had all survived, and that was what mattered most. Tank looked over at Dr. Chen, who was finally allowing the flight medic to treat her leg wound. "Angel," he said quietly. She looked up at him with tired eyes. "Thank you," Tank said simply. Morrison nodded in agreement. "You saved all our lives today, Doc. Peterson especially." Dr. Chen smiled weakly. "That's what medics do. We save lives." "No," Williams said from his stretcher. "That's what Rangers do. They never leave anyone behind." 3 weeks later, Peterson was back on his feet and cleared for duty. His recovery had been faster than anyone expected, largely due to the excellent field treatment he had received from Dr. Chen. The head injury that should have killed him had been managed so well in the field that the surgeons at the base hospital said it was one of the best examples of combat medical care they had ever seen. Dr. Chen had recovered from her own wounds and was back to full-duty status. But something had changed in the way the SEALs treated her. She was no longer the unknown medic they had to protect. She was Angel, the combat veteran who had saved their lives and proven herself under fire. The official after-action report mentioned her exceptional performance under combat conditions and recommended her for a medal. But for Dr. Chen, the real reward was much simpler. She had earned the respect and trust of the men she served with, and she had saved lives when it mattered most. Tank found her in the medical bay one evening, updating Peterson's medical records. "Hey, Angel," he said, using the name that had stuck among the entire SEAL team. "Hey, Tank, how's that shoulder feeling?" "Good as new, thanks to you." He paused for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why didn't you stay with the Rangers? You were obviously good at it." Dr. Chen thought for a moment before answering. "Because being a Ranger medic was about surviving impossible situations. Being a Navy doctor is about preventing those situations from being impossible in the first place. I'd rather save lives by being prepared than save lives by being lucky." Tank nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. But having you around makes us feel like maybe we can be lucky and prepared at the same time." Dr. Chen smiled. "That's the idea, Tank. That's the idea." Outside the medical bay, the sun was setting over the base. Tomorrow would bring new missions and new challenges, but tonight the team was safe and whole. For a combat medic, that was the best possible outcome. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, enemy fighters would tell stories about the tiny American medic who fought like a demon and saved her teammates against impossible odds. The stories would grow in the telling, as war stories always do. But the truth was remarkable enough. Dr. Sarah Chen, call sign Angel, had proven that heroism comes in many forms. Sometimes it's about charging into enemy fire. Sometimes it's about making impossible shots under pressure. And sometimes it's about simply refusing to give up, no matter how desperate the situation becomes. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all.